Have you ever witnessed a remarkable transformation, one that defied every doubt and turned a seemingly hopeless situation into a triumphant victory? In this story, a horse once cast aside as useless battles against his crippling injury, only to prove that hope, love, and perseverance can conquer even the darkest odds. From high-stakes confrontations with a millionaire breeder to desperate struggles to keep a rundown property, every twist reveals just how far one person will go to save a life worth fighting for. If you're curious how this spirited horse recovers and what becomes of the young woman who risked everything to help him, stay with us until the very end. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more captivating tales of courage and resilience. Your support means we can keep sharing stories that inspire hope and remind us all of the power in never giving up. Ronan Blackwood was a man of formidable presence and an even more formidable reputation. Standing at well over 6 feet tall, he had the kind of bearing that made people stop talking the moment he walked into a room. It wasn't just his height or his angular features that commanded attention, but the air of unwavering confidence that surrounded him, an invisible armor forged by years of success in the world of elite horse breed Moen. Ronan owned Blackwood Farms, a sprawling estate known for producing champion racehorses and show jumpers that fetched astronomical prices on the market. The stable hands often whispered that Ronan's gaze alone could evaluate a horse's potential before any veterinarian or trainer had a chance to utter an opinion. Whether that was true or mere folklore, no one questioned his uncanny ability to spot excellence. One crisp autumn afternoon, a new tension buzzed across the farmland. Word had spread that one of Ronan's prized stallions, an inky black horse named Midnight, had sustained a grave injury during training. Midnight had been the star of the stable, a paragon of speed and agility whose lineage traced back to some of the most illustrious studs in the country. Local rumor had it that Ronan had invested a small fortune in the horse's upbringing, meticulously grooming him to dominate the show circuit. The news of Midnight's injury sent a ripple of anxiety through the staff. Everyone knew how unforgiving Ronan could be when it came to what he called dead weight. Injuries that robbed a horse of its prime years were often seen by Ronan as business liabilities, something to be cut away for the sake of efficiency. Emily Hayes, a 19-year-old stable hand, had heard the hushed rumors circulating in the feed room. She had only been working at Blackwood Farms for a few months, landing the bow thanks to a family friend's recommendation. Her task mostly revolved around mucking stalls, grooming the lesser-known horses, and occasionally feeding the broodmares when the head groom was short-staffed. It wasn't glamorous, but she had always been drawn to animals, especially horses, and this job was the closest she had ever come to living out her dreams of caring for them. She was tall and lean with sun-kissed skin from working long hours in the open fields, her hazel eyes reflecting both determination and a gentle, empathetic soul. She had grown up in a small town not far away, raised by her grandmother in a modest, single-story house. After her grandmother's passing, Emily had inherited the aging property, which had since become both her refuge and her struggle, given the mounting bills she could barely pay. That same afternoon, Emily was tasked with cleaning the stalls near the training arena. She paused when she noticed a small group of workers gathered around the open doors. Slipping her pitchfork against the wall, she joined them quietly. The sight that met her eyes took her breath away. Midnight lay on his side in the dirt, his usually vibrant coat dulled by distress, and his flank trembling with what looked like pain. Ronan Blackwood stood a few yards away, arms folded, exuding impatience, as he listened to the head veterinarian detailing the severity of Midnight's leg injury. The mood was grim, no one dared speak above a hushed tone. And yet, as Emily looked into Midnight's tired, fearful eyes, she felt something stirring deep within her, a fierce need to protect, to help, and to heal. The veterinarian on duty that day was not Dr. Marcus Caldwell. He was, rather, a junior vet hired for routine checkups. But the pallor on his face indicated that what he had discovered was far from ordinary. "The ligament is severely torn," he explained, his voice tight. "We could consider surgery, but there's no guarantee he'll return to full competitive form. And the cost would be—" Ronan cut him off. "Astronomical, I'm sure," he said with a cold finality. "The horse's prime is already behind him if this injury is as bad as you say. I have no interest in pouring money down the drain." His voice echoed in the near-silent arena. A few stable workers shifted uncomfortably, knowing that a pronouncement from Ronan about a horse's fate was rarely reversed. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't known Midnight well, only admired him from a distance, but she felt an immediate kinship with the injured stallion. In his soft, pain-clouded gaze, she saw something broken, yet still fighting for life. She watched in horror as two farmhands began to prepare a trailer at Ronan's direction. It was routine practice. Any horse deemed unviable would be sent off, often to places Emily shuddered to think about. She remembered whispering to a fellow stable hand once, "Where do they go?" The older worker had only shrugged. Some are given away, some are auctioned, some are put down if the vet bill is too high, he'd replied with somber resignation. Emily could not fathom such a fate befalling a creature that had once been the pride of Blackwood Farms. And yet, it was happening right before her eyes. Before she could think it through, she stepped forward, her throat tight with nerves. "Mr. Blackwood?" Her voice barely cut through the awkward silence. Ronan turned slowly, eyes narrowing at this young woman who dared interrupt. Emily swallowed hard, summoning the courage she didn't realize she possessed. "You can't just discard him like trash. Midnight's a living being who deserves a chance, even if he can't compete anymore." A flicker of annoyance creased Ronan's brow. "And who are you exactly?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Emily straightened her shoulders. "Emily Hayes, sir. I work the morning shift in stable block 3. But that's beside the point. You can't just send him away. Let him heal. Let him live. Isn't there something else he can do, even if he can't race?" Ronan's lips curved into a mirthless smile. "This isn't a philanthropic operation, Miss Hayes. It's a business. Midnight is unfortunately a liability. If someone else wants to play hero and pay for his treatment, they're welcome to it. But Blackwood Farms has no need for a show horse that can't show." The group of employees stood silent. Even the junior veterinarian seemed unsure how to respond. Emily felt her cheeks burn as she realized how brazen her words must have seemed to her boss. But there was no turning back now. Something about Midnight's plight tore at her heart, and she couldn't walk away. Despite the risk of losing her job or even facing Ronan's wrath, her conscience screamed that this was a life worth saving. Emily inhaled sharply, then forced out the words that would change her future in ways she could barely imagine. "I'll take him," she said, voice trembling, but determined. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Ronan's eyes widened slightly, and the small group of stable hands exchanged incredulous glances. Emily felt her stomach tighten into knots, but she stood her ground. She had no actual plan, and certainly not the funds to cover a complicated horse surgery, but the thought of letting Midnight be discarded to an uncertain fate felt more horrifying than any risk she might endure. Ronan arched an eyebrow. "You'll take him," he repeated, as if testing the words on his tongue. "And how, pray tell, do you intend to manage that, Miss Hayes? This horse's upkeep alone could break you, and that's before we talk about medical bills." He looked at her threadbare jacket and mud-stained boots, and his condescending stare made her feel smaller than she ever had. Still, she refused to look away. "I'll figure it out," Emily replied, trying to keep her voice steady. In truth, she had no idea how she would pay for even a fraction of the costs. Her grandmother's old cabin was in disrepair, and the patch of land it stood on had little more than a tumble-down barn once used for goats. She didn't even own a horse trailer. She barely made enough to cover her monthly groceries, let alone veterinarian fees. But all those thoughts, terrifying as they were, remained in the back of her mind. She simply could not let this horse's story end on a muddy patch of ground at Blackwood Farms. Ronan regarded her for a moment longer, then let out a humorless laugh. "So be it. Midnight is yours if you can handle that responsibility. But don't expect a dime from me. The horse comes with no papers, no obligations, and no further financial support from Blackwood Farms. Understood?" Emily nodded, a mix of relief and dread flooding her senses. She had saved Midnight from immediate doom, but now she faced a challenge that seemed almost insurmountable. Ronan gestured dismissively to the farmhands, who stopped preparing the trailer. "Load him onto her truck, assuming she has one," he said, his voice thick with sarcasm. That was the next hurdle. Emily's small pickup, a rusted relic she'd inherited along with her grandmother's cabin, was definitely not equipped to transport a large injured stallion. With a trembling voice, Emily made a quick arrangement with a coworker, Angie, who owned a basic horse trailer and was willing to drive it for a small fee. The other stable hands looked at Emily as though she had lost her mind, but no one openly challenged her decision. Perhaps some of them secretly rooted for her, a glimmer of hope in a world dominated by the cold logic of money and competition. As they carefully led Midnight into Angie's trailer, Emily stood by, her heart pounding. Midnight limped, his posture drooping with exhaustion, but there was a glimmer of relief in his dark eyes. The moment the stallion was securely inside, Emily turned back to see Ronan already walking away, his phone out, his thoughts undoubtedly moving on to the next profitable venture. The deed was done. Midnight was now her responsibility, a broken champion, an expensive burden, and in her eyes, a precious life that deserved a fighting chance. Angie's trailer rattled along the dusty back roads as the sun began its slow descent. Emily followed in her pickup, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. She couldn't stop the litany of doubts from swirling in her mind. What if Midnight's injury was worse than the veterinarian had let on? How would she afford feed, let alone expensive medical treatments? And what if the horse never recovered? Yet every time she considered the enormity of what she'd taken on, she pictured Midnight's soft eyes, silently pleading for someone to care enough not to throw him away. By the time they reached Emily's grandmother's old property, the sky had turned a bruised shade of purple. The cabin itself was situated at the end of a narrow, winding driveway. It wasn't much to look at, faded wooden siding and a roof patched up with mismatched shingles. But it was home. Behind the cabin lay a small barn that had once housed a few goats and chickens. Emily had to do a quick evaluation of the barn before Angie backed the trailer in. The wooden stalls and dusty hayloft weren't exactly up to the standards of Blackwood Farms, but with some cleaning and reinforcement, it would have to do as a temporary shelter for Midnight. Once parked, Angie opened the trailer's back gate, letting down the ramp. Midnight nickered softly, stepping awkwardly onto the hard ground. He lifted his head to take in his new surroundings, ears flicking at the unfamiliar noises of rustling leaves and distant crickets. Emily stood by his side, stroking his neck to reassure him. "It's not much," she murmured, "but we'll make it work, I promise." Midnight's ears swiveled toward her, and though horses couldn't understand words the same way people do, Emily felt a wordless bond forming. She looked into his eyes and silently vowed that she wouldn't let him down. Angie helped Emily guide Midnight into the barn and settle him into the largest of the three stalls. The space was cramped, but a thick layer of fresh straw helped cushion Midnight's injured leg as he shifted his weight. Emily thanked Angie profusely for driving the trailer, explaining she'd pay her as soon as she had enough saved. Angie simply patted Emily on the shoulder. "You did a brave thing today," she said, her gaze moving from Emily to Midnight. "But brave doesn't always mean easy. You need anything, you let me know." After Angie left, Emily stood alone in the barn, the dim light of a single bulb casting shadows across the wooden beams. Midnight shifted uneasily, testing his brace. Emily's eyes roamed over his sleek coat, now marred by scars of swelling and tension around the injured leg. She felt an overwhelming mixture of hope and fear. On the one hand, she'd saved him from immediate slaughter or whatever grim fate awaited him at the hands of profit-driven dealers. On the other, she had taken a leap into the dark with no safety net, no clear plan, and barely enough money for her own groceries. That night, Emily barely slept. She made up a small bed of blankets in the loft above Midnight's stall so she could hear if he got restless or if his condition worsened. The wind outside howled through the trees, and a soft drizzle began to tap against the barn's roof. Curled up in her makeshift bed, Emily stared at the glow of the barn light below, her mind racing with potential solutions. She considered taking out a loan, but banks were unlikely to trust a 19-year-old with no collateral except a rundown cabin. She also thought about asking for more hours at Blackwood Farms, but after the stunt she had pulled, she wasn't sure if Ronan would keep her employed for much longer. Around midnight, she heard Midnight shifting in his stall and rose to check on him. He was awake, his ears perked warily. Emily gently rubbed his muzzle, whispering soothing words. "We'll figure it out," she said, more for herself than for him. Despite her anxiety, she felt a small surge of warmth. Here was a creature that had been destined for abandonment. But now, at least, he wasn't alone. Morning came sooner than she would have liked. The drizzle had turned into a steady rain, making the ground outside muddy and slick. Emily carefully navigated the puddles as she fetched buckets of water from the cabin's outdoor spigot. Midnight was quiet, but the tension in his body was evident. She prepared a simple bran mash, the only feed she had on hand, and placed it in a bucket for him. He ate slowly, pausing occasionally as if still unsure of his new environment. After giving him fresh bedding and double-checking the makeshift brace on his leg, Emily hopped into her pickup to head to Blackwood Farms for her shift. She had already missed the early morning feeding chores, so she expected a stern talking to, or worse. On the drive over, her mind revisited every possible scenario of what might happen. Would Ronan fire her on the spot? Would the rest of the staff resent her for making waves and dragging a broken horse away? She found some comfort in knowing that she'd done the right thing morally, even if it wasn't the wisest move from a financial standpoint. Arriving at the farm, she went straight to the main stable block, where she found Brigitte, the head groom, assigning tasks. Brigitte barely looked up from her clipboard. "You're late," she said in a clipped tone. Emily swallowed, trying to explain, but Brigitte waved a hand dismissively. "Just get to work, Hayes. Stall cleaning, then the morning feed." Relieved she wasn't immediately dismissed, Emily hurried to start her chores, ignoring the curious or disapproving stares from her colleagues. As she picked up a pitchfork, she caught a glimpse of Ronan passing by the stable doors, his phone pressed to his ear. He looked in her direction but gave no sign of acknowledgement. She wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. The hours ticked by with grueling slowness. Emily shoved away her worries about Midnight's leg and her uncertain future, focusing on one task at a time, mucking out stalls, refilling water troughs, and stacking bales of hay. She kept her head down, hoping to avoid any direct confrontation with Ronan. During a short break, she noticed Angie in the feed room, sorting through bags of grain. Emily took a moment to slip inside. "Thanks again for yesterday," Emily said in a hushed tone. "I'll pay you back as soon as I can." Angie waved off her concern. "I'm not worried about it. I just hope you know what you're doing. Midnight's not a normal horse. He's used to top-tier care." Emily sighed, running a hand through her messy ponytail. "I know, but I couldn't let him go. I have to believe there's a way to help him recover, at least enough so he's not in constant pain." Angie nodded, weighing a scoop of grain. "I get it. Just be careful. That kind of loyalty can lead you into deep water." By the time Emily finished her chores, the late afternoon sun had broken through the morning rain, casting warm beams across the paddocks. She decided to see if she could approach the junior vet, the one who had examined Midnight, for a more detailed explanation. She found him in the far corner of the main stable, checking on a mare with a minor infection. "Hi," she said quietly, not wanting to startle him. "I was hoping to ask a few questions about Midnight's injury." The veterinarian, Dr. Peters, looked up from his notes. His face was still etched with the concern he'd shown the day before. "Of course," he replied, his tone neutral. Emily hesitated, unsure how to phrase her request. "I wanted to get a second opinion, or maybe some more details about what exactly happened. I know the ligament is torn, but is there any chance he could recover with proper care?" Dr. Peters removed his glasses, rubbing his eyes. "A torn suspensory ligament is serious, especially in a performance horse. It can heal to a point, but it often leaves them with lingering lameness or, at best, a reduced capacity for athletic competition. The cost of surgery and rehab can be prohibitive, and there's still no guarantee." Emily nodded, absorbing the information. "But with time and therapy, could he, I don't know, live comfortably?" There was a hint of empathy in the vet's gaze. "Yes, it's possible, but you'd need a good vet specializing in equine orthopedics, and you'd have to follow a strict routine. Stall rest, controlled exercise, maybe even specialized supplements. Are you ready for that kind of commitment?" It was a fair question. Emily felt a lump in her throat as she admitted, "I'm not sure, but I have to try." Dr. Peters offered a small, tight smile. "If you really want to do everything you can, talk to Dr. Marcus Caldwell. He used to be the best in the region. But he's semi-retired now, doesn't take many cases. Still, he might be willing to help if he sees how determined you are." By the time Emily returned home that evening, her arms and legs ached from the day's labor. She parked her pickup behind the cabin and hurried into the barn, heart pounding as she wondered how Midnight had fared during her long absence. She flicked on the light to find the stallion lying down in the straw, his ears perking up at the sound of her footsteps. Relief washed over her. He was alive, at least, and not thrashing in pain. Carefully, she knelt beside him, running a gentle hand along his neck. The warmth of his body beneath her fingers brought a surge of gratitude she couldn't quite put into words. "Hey there, big guy," she murmured, checking the brace on his injured leg. It was still securely in place, though she could tell Midnight had been restless at some point. The straw was kicked around, and the water bucket was slightly tipped. She replaced the water, then offered him another small meal of bran mash mixed with what meager supplements she could afford. Though Dr. Peters' warning echoed in her mind about the high cost of long-term therapy, she refused to let that doubt paralyze her. She wouldn't give up on Midnight, not when he had no one else. After finishing her chores, Emily trudged into the cabin, where she boiled water for a simple bowl of instant noodles. She ate by the dim light of a single lamp, scanning her phone for any listings or ads for part-time work she could do outside her morning job. Babysitting, dog walking, yard work. She was open to anything that could help cover the growing list of expenses. In the back of her mind, she also remembered Dr. Peters' suggestion. Reach out to Dr. Marcus Caldwell. But how? She had heard rumors about Caldwell's brilliance, stories of horses once deemed hopeless, making miraculous recoveries under his watchful eye, but also that he was notoriously selective in the cases he took on. She toyed with the idea of calling him immediately, but the hour was late, and her own exhaustion weighed heavily on her. Instead, she resolved to track down his contact information the following day. She finished her noodles, washed the dish in the battered sink, and flipped through a worn notebook where she jotted down any new ideas or leads. In the quiet of the cabin, the enormity of her situation settled in again. She had a badly injured horse, an uncertain job status, and mounting expenses for which she had no clear plan. Still, as she crept back out to the barn before bedtime to check on Midnight one last time, she felt a glimmer of hope. He neighed softly, almost as if in greeting, and she leaned over the stall door to run her fingers through his mane. "I don't have all the answers," she whispered, "but I promise I'll do my best." Midnight's dark eyes reflected the soft glow of the barn light, and for a moment Emily felt less alone. They were both taking tentative steps into the unknown, forging an unbreakable bond that neither money nor doubt could sever. When Emily woke the next morning, her first thought was of Midnight. She pulled on her boots without breakfast and hurried out to the barn, bracing herself for whatever she might find. Her heart lifted a little when she saw him standing, rather than lying immobile in the straw. Though he held his weight awkwardly, it was still an improvement over the day before. After greeting him with a soft pat on the neck, she fed him a measured scoop of grain mixed with bran. Financially, it was all she could manage for now, but she hoped it would help maintain his strength. As she checked the makeshift brace, a pang of guilt gnawed at her. She needed professional help, someone who knew far more than she did about equine rehabilitation. That thought nudged her into action. She hurried inside the cabin, rummaging through a kitchen drawer until she found an old business directory her grandmother had kept. Dusting it off, she flipped through pages filled with local plumbers, roofers, and handymen. At last, she found a dog-eared page devoted to veterinarians. Near the bottom was a faded listing for Dr. Marcus Caldwell, accompanied by an address and phone number. Even before she tried calling, a swarm of doubts clouded her mind. Would the number even work? Would he be willing to help? She'd heard stories, legends really, that Dr. Caldwell was once renowned for his skill in handling the worst equine injuries, but he'd also become something of a recluse, turning down more cases than he accepted. With trembling fingers, she dialed in his number on her cell phone. The line rang several times, and just as she prepared to leave a voicemail, a gruff voice answered. "Caldwell here," he said, sounding as though he'd been dragged from a deep sleep. Emily introduced herself haltingly, explaining Midnight's injury. She spoke of his background as a high-level show horse, his abrupt abandonment, and her desperate attempt to save him. She had barely finished speaking when Dr. Caldwell interrupted with a weary sigh. "Young lady, I'm not in the practice of picking up lost causes," he said, his tone matter-of-fact rather than cruel. "I've spent a lifetime patching up horses for owners with deep pockets, and I retired because I couldn't stand seeing animals pushed beyond their limits for money." A swell of panic formed in Emily's chest. "Please," she implored, "this isn't about making him compete. I just want him to have a chance. A life that isn't cut short just because he can't win trophies anymore. There was a long silence on the other end. She could almost feel Dr. Caldwell weighing her words. Finally, he spoke again. I'll drop by later in the week to take a look. No promises. If I come, I'll want to see commitment. From you, not just the horse. Understood? Relief flooded her and she choked out a quick thank you, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. Once the call ended, she sagged against the kitchen counter, letting out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Dr. Marcus Caldwell was coming. It was a risk. She had no idea how she'd afford his expertise, but at least Midnight might get the real help he needed. Over the next few days, Emily worked tirelessly to prepare for Dr. Caldwell's visit. Between her shifts at Blackwood Farms and the limited free time she had at night, she tried to improve conditions in the old barn. Armed with a hammer, nails, and a rickety ladder, she patched up the leaking roof and repaired loose floorboards. Her grandmother's cabin had been a homestead of sorts, designed for smaller livestock, not a horse that once commanded top dollar in elite competitions. Yet Emily's determination made up for the structure's shortcomings, at least in part. She was also trying to bolster her finances in whatever way she could. Initially, she sought extra hours at Blackwood Farms, but Ronan Blackwood remained aloof, and Brigitte, the head groom, seemed lukewarm toward the idea. Angie offered what support she could, occasionally slipping Emily a spare bale of hay or a small bag of feed meant for the older broodmares. But Emily sensed the unspoken tension. She was aware that her co-workers worried that if they helped her too much, they might draw Ronan's disapproval. Undeterred, Emily babysat for a neighbor's kids on weekends and even considered an ad for delivering local newspapers at dawn. It was exhausting, but she reminded herself that every dollar counted. By the end of the third day, she felt physically and emotionally spent. She'd just finished tacking up a row of stalls at Blackwood Farms when she noticed Ronan watching her from a distance. He seemed to regard her with mild curiosity, though his expression remained guarded. Emily tried not to let his presence rattle her, but she couldn't help replaying their last conversation in her mind. His cold dismissal of Midnight and his biting sarcasm about her heroics. That evening, she drove home under a sky thick with rain clouds. When she pulled into her driveway, the heavens opened up, drenching everything in sight. Sprinting to the barn, she found Midnight trembling in a corner stall, startled by the thunder that rumbled in the distance. She gently stroked his neck, whispering soothing words even as the storm pelted the roof with a relentless staccato. Despite the dreary weather, she was heartened to see that Midnight's leg brace remained secure and dry, thanks to her patchwork repairs on the barn roof. It was far from a perfect setup, but it was progress. She spent the better part of an hour calming him, humming lullabies her grandmother had taught her. Slowly, he relaxed under her touch. Then, in a moment that took her breath away, Midnight nuzzled her shoulder, releasing a soft whinny that almost sounded like gratitude. That small gesture ignited a flicker of hope in Emily's chest. Perhaps he could sense that she was doing everything she could, that she wasn't going to abandon him the way others had. As the storm raged outside, Emily sank onto a bale of hay, cradling her aching head in her hands. In mere days, Dr. Caldwell would arrive, and with him came the possibility of a real medical plan, or the crushing reality that Midnight's condition was beyond saving. Either way, Emily knew that her resolve was about to be tested in ways she'd never imagined. When Dr. Marcus Caldwell finally rolled into Emily's driveway, it was mid-morning on a Saturday. Emily stood by the barn door, nervously twisting her hands, as an old pickup truck rattled to a stop. The man who emerged was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a weathered jacket and a scowl that seemed etched into his features. His hair was silver at the temples, and a thin scar ran along his jawline, hinting at a life of rugged experiences. He greeted Emily with a curt nod, then motioned for her to lead him inside. Midnight snorted apprehensively at the sight of a stranger, stepping away as Caldwell approached. "Easy, fella," the vet murmured, his voice low and surprisingly gentle. He reached out a hand and let Midnight sniff his palm before he attempted any examination. Emily could see the man's demeanor shift from gruff to focused in a heartbeat. Over the next 40 minutes, Dr. Caldwell ran his hands along Midnight's leg, palpating the injured area and checking the existing brace. Emily hovered, heart pounding. The stallion flinched a few times, ears pinning back, but Caldwell remained calm, quietly assessing every reaction. When at last he stood up, his expression was guarded. "Well, it's a nasty tear," he said, brushing straw off his jacket. "He's lost a good deal of muscle tone in the injured hind leg, too. That brace you have is functional, but not ideal." Emily swallowed, forcing down her nerves. "Can it be treated?" Caldwell exhaled heavily. "Possibly. With the right care, stall rest, cold therapy, anti-inflammatory meds, gradually introducing controlled exercise. Maybe a specialized brace. But you need to understand, this isn't a magic trick. We're talking months of rehab, maybe longer. And the cost?" He paused, clearly gauging her reaction. "It could be substantial." Dread coiled in Emily's stomach. She knew her savings were already dangerously low. Still, she lifted her chin. "I don't care about competition or making him race again. I just want him to live without pain and have a chance at a normal life." Caldwell considered her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, I'm willing to help, on two conditions. One, you follow my instructions to the letter. I won't waste my time if you slack on his therapy. Two, you pay for the materials and meds as we go. I'll minimize my fee as best I can, but the rest isn't up to me." Relief warred with apprehension in Emily's chest. She nodded, tears stinging her eyes. "Thank you, Dr. Caldwell. I promise I'll do whatever it takes." He let out a half sigh, half chuckle. "We'll see, Miss Hayes. Determination is good, but this is going to be tough for both of you." He pulled out a notepad and began scribbling down a list: recommended supplements, a schedule for icing the leg, and instructions on how to transition from stall rest to brief, guided walks. Before leaving, he handed Emily a business card. "This has my cell number. Call if there's any serious change or if you have questions about his exercises." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "And don't push too hard too soon. Patience and consistency, that's what it takes to bring a horse back from an injury like this." With that, he climbed into his old truck and backed out of the driveway, leaving Emily clutching the notepad like a lifeline. The regimen Dr. Caldwell prescribed was nothing short of daunting. 3 times a day, Emily had to gently ice Midnight's leg to reduce inflammation, then apply a special ointment Caldwell had mixed himself. After each treatment, she carefully wrapped the leg in fresh bandages. If the weather stayed mild, Caldwell suggested leading Midnight out for 5-minute walks twice daily, keeping his pace slow and steady. Emily could hardly remember the last time she'd followed such a strict schedule. Her world revolved around chaotic shifts at Blackwood Farms and impromptu odd jobs. Now, every spare minute was meticulously planned for Midnight's care. The early days of this regimen tested Emily's willpower in unexpected ways. At first, Midnight resisted leaving his stall, clearly associating movement with pain. He'd shift his weight and paw at the ground nervously, ears tilting back whenever she tried to guide him into a walk. But Emily's gentle persistence gradually won out. Each time they circled the small paddock, she spoke in soothing tones, praising him for every cautious step he took. By the end of the second week, he no longer balked at the barn door, but still walked with a pronounced limp. Financially, Emily was scraping the bottom of the barrel. The specialized ointments and leg wraps, plus a better diet of high-quality feed, quickly gobbled up what meager savings she had left. She began baking cookies in bulk and selling them to neighbors, standing by the local grocery store with a homemade sign to attract customers. A few folks recognized her from high school. They admired her dedication once she told them about Midnight's story, often adding a small donation to help the cause. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start. In the meantime, Ronan Blackwood hardly spoke to her at the farm, but Emily caught glimpses of him through the stable windows or near the outdoor arenas. Sometimes their eyes would meet, and Emily felt an unspoken tension flare between them. Part of her wanted to march up and show him that Midnight was improving, albeit slowly. Another part feared that if Ronan sensed the slightest struggle, he'd try to reclaim the horse or sabotage her effort out of some twisted sense of pride. Either way, he remained distant, and she found it easier to keep her head down and focus on her work. It was Angie who reassured her one afternoon when Emily, exhausted and near tears, confided that she didn't know how long she could keep this up. "You'll be all right," Angie said, patting her shoulder in the quiet corner of the tack room. "You've come this far, haven't you? Just keep going." Midnight seems different already, calmer. And Caldwell wouldn't have taken you on if he didn't see some glimmer of hope. Emily nodded, moved by her friend's words. She was in too deep to quit now. Her days were a blur of stable work, side gigs, and horse rehab, leaving her to collapse into bed each night with scarcely a moment to think. But in Midnight's eyes, she saw gratitude and trust growing with each passing day, a silent promise that they were forging a bond neither had ever expected to find. Just as the routine began to settle, another threat loomed on the horizon. The bank. Late one afternoon, Emily returned from Blackwood Farms to find a white envelope taped to her door. Inside was a sternly worded notice about overdue property taxes on her grandmother's land. She had fallen behind last year when she first left high school to care for her ailing grandmother. After her grandmother passed, Emily's minimum wage salary at the farm had barely covered monthly living costs, let alone property taxes. The notice stated in no uncertain terms that if she didn't catch up on payments, she could face foreclosure proceedings. Panic gripped her. The idea of losing the cabin and the barn was unthinkable, especially now that Midnight depended on her. After a sleepless night, she braced herself and visited the local branch office to plead for an extension. She spoke to a pale-faced loan officer named Mr. Gibson, who listened politely but showed little flexibility. The best he could offer was a short grace period, along with a pointed reminder that if she missed the new deadline, the bank could seize her property. Exiting the branch office, Emily found herself on the brink of tears. It felt like every step forward with Midnight was matched by some new setback. She tried to remind herself that her grandmother had endured financial hardships too, yet always found a way through. Perhaps she could take a second job, something steadier than selling cookies or babysitting. That very day, she strolled into a roadside diner at the edge of town and asked if they needed extra help. The manager, a stout woman with a sympathetic smile, offered her weekend shifts as a dishwasher. It wasn't glamorous, but it was guaranteed pay. Back at the barn, Emily tried not to let her anxiety show when she saw Dr. Caldwell's pickup parked in the driveway. He was kneeling by Midnight's leg, applying a different brace he'd brought along. "This'll stabilize the joint better," he explained, glancing at Emily. "How's the budget holding up for supplies?" Her throat tightened. Should she tell him how dire things were? Dr. Caldwell seemed to sense her hesitation. "I have a few connections that might help you get feed at a discounted rate. Won't fix everything, but it'll ease some of the burden." Emily felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's just, there's so much going on. Bills, the property, and, well, everything else." Caldwell patted Midnight's flank, then rose to face her. "I've seen folks who claim to love their animals, then abandon them at the first sign of trouble. You, on the other hand, are hanging in there. Don't give up." That quiet encouragement somehow bolstered Emily's frayed nerves. She asked about Midnight's progress, holding her breath for his verdict. Caldwell nodded. "He's responding. There's less heat and swelling in the tendon, but the next few weeks are crucial. Keep up with the icing, wrapping, and gentle walks. And remember, you can call me if anything changes." As he left, Emily stroked Midnight's muzzle, letting her worries momentarily fade. She clung to Caldwell's words like a lifeline. Don't give up. It was the simplest advice, but also the hardest to follow when everything felt so uncertain. Yet as she looked into Midnight's gentle eyes, she found the resolve to push forward. She would save him, and in doing so, maybe she would save herself from sinking under the weight of her fears. The following week tested Emily's spirit in ways she never expected. Balancing her commitments at Blackwood Farms, weekend dishwashing at the diner, and the intense schedule of caring for Midnight left her on the brink of exhaustion. She woke before dawn to tend to him, carefully unwrapping his leg, icing it, and applying the medicated salve Caldwell had given her. Then she hurried to the diner for a 6-hour shift scrubbing dishes and cleaning tables. By mid-afternoon, she raced to Blackwood Farms for her stable chores, often finishing after sunset. Finally, she returned to her property to walk Midnight under the faint glow of an old floodlight she'd rigged behind the barn. And yet, for all her dedication, setbacks were inevitable. One gray morning, she found Midnight lying down and breathing heavily, refusing to stand. Her heart thundered in her chest as she knelt in the straw, worrying he'd done something to exacerbate his injury. She pressed shaky hands to his flank, feeling the warmth of his coat and the tension rippling through his muscles. The fear of losing him snaked through her mind, leaving her almost paralyzed. She called Dr. Caldwell in a panic, half expecting him to say there was nothing more to be done. But when he arrived a few hours later, he conducted a thorough check and discovered that the weather shift and damp conditions had likely caused stiffness in the old injury, making Midnight reluctant to move. He hasn't regressed, but he's in pain, Caldwell explained. We need to keep him warm and dry. Maybe add some mild anti-inflammatories to his regimen. Relief and guilt washed over Emily in equal measure. She realized how fragile Midnight's progress was, how a single bad day could derail weeks of careful healing. She vowed to keep a closer eye on him, even if it meant sacrificing more of her already limited rest. Dr. Caldwell, noticing her sleepless eyes and trembling hands, urged caution. Burn yourself out, and you'll be no use to him, he said bluntly. Pace yourself, Emily. That night, as a cold drizzle pattered on the barn roof, she sat beside Midnight, stroking the silk of his mane while her own fatigue weighed her down. She thought about her grandmother and the unwavering kindness she'd always shown. A memory surfaced of her grandmother nursing a stray cat with a broken leg, feeding it warmed milk through an eyedropper. Grandma's gentle perseverance had instilled in Emily the belief that every living creature deserved a chance. Midnight shifted, lifting his head to rest it gently against her knee. She smiled through the blur of tears. In that moment, she understood that caring for him went beyond simply treating a torn ligament. It was about restoring his faith in a world that had so carelessly cast him aside. Though her body ached and her bank account dwindled, Emily felt a fierce love that fueled her determination. She might be exhausted, but she refused to let him down. 2 weeks later, on a rare sunny afternoon, Emily led Midnight out to the small paddock behind the barn. The grass, still damp from the past night's rain, glistened under the midday light. She hadn't dared let him walk on uneven ground before, but Dr. Caldwell had given cautious permission for slightly longer, supervised outings. Though he still carried a slight limp, Midnight's steps were more confident than she had ever seen since his arrival. Emily guided him in slow circles, feeling a swell of pride each time his hooves found steady footing. His ears flicked forward, and he even tossed his head in as if excited by the fresh air. Emily couldn't help but grin. She could almost imagine what he must have been like in his glory days. Swift, fearless, the center of attention at prestigious events. Yet here he was, a discarded champion, rediscovering his stride in a humble backyard paddock. The moment of peace was cut short by the sound of an engine rumbling up the gravel driveway. Emily turned, her heart dipping when she recognized Ronan Blackwood's sleek black SUV. A lump formed in her throat. The last time he had shown up unannounced, it was to remind her how futile he considered her efforts. She patted Midnight's neck, then looped the lead rope over a fence post before walking to meet Ronan near the barn. He stepped out, meticulously dressed in polished boots and a tailored coat, an image of wealth and power that starkly contrasted with Emily's mud-splattered jeans. His gaze flicked to the paddock where Midnight stood, ears alert. He's still alive, I see, Ronan remarked, neither warm nor cold, just blunt. Emily squared her shoulders. He's making progress, she said simply. Ronan's eyes narrowed as he assessed the horse from a distance. I heard through the grapevine that you hired Marcus Caldwell. That must be costing you more than you can afford. His words, though calm, felt like a gut punch. Emily forced herself not to flinch. Dr. Caldwell's helping in exchange for a smaller fee than usual. He believes Midnight can have a decent life. Ronan let out a short, humorless laugh. Belief is cheap, reality isn't. He paused, then added, Look, I'll make you a final offer. Sell him back to me. I can find him some use, maybe as a therapy horse if he can't compete. He shrugged as if it were no big deal. At least you'd recoup something, save yourself from the financial hole you're digging. Emily's heart pounded. She glanced at Midnight, remembering the stormy nights, the tearful mornings, the relentless schedule of rehab. Could she even imagine giving him up after everything they'd been through? No, she said quietly yet firmly. He's not for sale. Ronan studied her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he gave a curt nod. Suit yourself, he said, turning to leave. But just before getting back into his SUV, he glanced once more at Midnight. For a fleeting instant, Emily thought she saw a trace of admiration in Ronan's eyes, like he was impressed, even if he'd never say it. Then without another word, he drove away, leaving Emily alone with her resolve and the sound of midnight's gentle snort echoing in the clear afternoon air. Spring arrived with a quiet flourish, replacing the bitter chill of winter with the gentle warmth of sunshine and the soft buzz of new life. By now, Emily's days had fallen into a precarious balance. She awoke at first light to tend to Midnight, who was growing noticeably stronger each week. His limp was still there, a stubborn reminder of his injury, but Dr. Caldwell often remarked on how lucky they were that the damage hadn't been worse. The tendon, he said, was mending, slowly but surely. After each morning's gentle therapy session, Emily would dash to her dishwasher shift at the diner, then on to Blackwood Farms, where the stable chores awaited. Exhaustion was her constant companion, but she was fueled by the knowledge that Midnight was steadily improving. One crisp morning, Emily stood outside her cabin, sipping a hastily made cup of instant coffee. She gazed at the paddock where Midnight now ventured with noticeable confidence. He lowered his muzzle to the dew-kissed grass, his ears flicking occasionally as he savored the simple pleasure of grazing. For Emily, these small changes, his calmer demeanor, the subtle extension of his stride, felt like monumental victories. She had risked everything to save him, and though her life had become a never-ending cycle of work, debt, and sleepless nights, she couldn't imagine returning to the days before his arrival. Financial strain, however, continued to press in from all sides. The bank's grace period was ticking away, and Emily still hadn't gathered enough funds to pay off the overdue property taxes. The weekend shifts at the diner provided a steady trickle of income, but not nearly enough to cover the looming sum. Each time she glanced at the pile of unpaid bills on her kitchen table, a pang of fear lanced through her. She wrestled with the possibility of selling off heirlooms left behind by her grandmother. Fine china, an antique sewing machine, even a dusty old piano that hadn't been tuned in decades. Yet each item carried memories too precious to discard lightly. Her grandmother had been the one who taught her to love animals, to show compassion for all living creatures. Parting with those mementos felt like erasing a piece of that legacy. In the midst of these worries, Emily also noticed an undercurrent of speculation running through Blackwood Farms. Most of her co-workers steered clear of the topic of Midnight, and Ronan Blackwood himself maintained his distance. Yet she sensed whispers whenever she walked by, murmurs about how she was running herself ragged for a horse with no future, how she was bound to lose the farm, how maybe Ronan had been right all along. She tried not to let it affect her, but the doubts sometimes crept in during the long, lonely hours of the night. Still, she soldiered on. Dr. Caldwell's visits continued, although they were less frequent now. He was pleased with the rate of Midnight's recovery, repeatedly emphasizing that the next few months would prove critical for building muscle and preventing re-injury. The therapy sessions had progressed from simple walks to light trotting exercises, carefully measured to avoid overexertion. Emily kept meticulous notes on Midnight's daily progress, how many steps he took, how often he stumbled, and any sign of pain. It was a routine that gave her purpose, a sense of control, and most importantly, hope. As Midnight's condition stabilized, Dr. Caldwell began introducing new elements to his rehab regimen. He taught Emily how to apply gentle massages along Midnight's spine and hindquarters, explaining how important it was to maintain overall muscle function. At first, Emily felt awkward attempting these techniques. She worried she would inadvertently hurt Midnight or fail to apply the correct pressure. But with each session, her confidence grew. She learned to feel the subtle shifts in muscle tension beneath his coat, to sense when he was relaxed or bracing against discomfort. Their bond deepened, and Emily found that Midnight looked forward to these sessions, standing patiently while she worked her hands over his body. In between these carefully orchestrated therapy routines, Emily continued her desperate quest to save her grandmother's property. Late-night internet searches revealed government assistance programs, emergency grants, and even philanthropic organizations that sometimes offered help for individuals facing foreclosure. She filled out countless applications, her eyes blurring from reading legal fine print and writing impassioned personal statements. In every form, she pleaded her case, a young woman fighting to save not just her home, but also a once great stallion who deserved a second chance. For weeks on end, she heard nothing but radio silence or polite rejections. Each time a rejection email appeared in her inbox, her heart sank further. Yet some small spark of faith compelled her to keep trying. Maybe it was the memory of her grandmother's unwavering resilience. Maybe it was the steady improvement in Midnight's gait. Or maybe it was the kindness of people like Angie and Dr. Caldwell, who reminded her that not everyone viewed life solely through the lens of profit and loss. Whatever the reason, Emily refused to accept that they would lose the cabin and be forced to move Midnight elsewhere. Or worse, lose him entirely. One afternoon, after finishing her shift at the diner, Emily returned home to find an unfamiliar car parked in the driveway. Her pulse quickened, fearing it was the bank's representative coming to deliver final notice. But when she approached, she recognized the woman who emerged from the driver's seat as a reporter from a local newspaper. The woman introduced herself as Grace Carlisle, explaining that she had heard about Emily's plight through one of the many applications Emily had sent. The story of a teenager who rescued a discarded champion horse had piqued Grace's interest. "Would you be willing to let me interview you?" the reporter asked, her tone genuine and curious. "I'd like to write an article about your situation. Maybe it could help you raise awareness or funds." Emily hesitated, a swirl of emotions churning inside her. She had no desire to become a public spectacle, but at the same time she was running out of options. If telling her story could bring in donations or alert someone with the means to help, wasn't it worth trying? In the end, her desperation outweighed her discomfort. She led Grace to the barn where Midnight stood placidly in his stall, content after his latest therapy session. Over the next hour, Emily poured out the entire saga: Midnight's injury, Ronan's decision to cast him aside, her own struggle to keep him alive and well despite mounting debts. Grace listened intently, taking notes and snapping a few photos of Midnight's injured leg and the humble surroundings that now served as his sanctuary. The newspaper article ran 2 weeks later under the headline, "Local Teen Fights to Save Discarded Champion Horse." Emily picked up a copy from the diner's newsstand on her break, her hands trembling with a mixture of hope and dread as she flipped through the pages. The piece was heartfelt and detailed, describing her determination, the looming threat of foreclosure, and the fragile progress Midnight had made. Grace had even included quotes from Dr. Caldwell, who emphasized that while the horse's competitive days were behind him, a pain-free life was still very much within reach. For a few days, not much happened. Emily continued her routine, wondering if the article had fallen on deaf ears. Then, to her astonishment, letters began to arrive at the post office box she'd listed in the paper. Some contained small donations, $10 or $20, accompanied by handwritten notes of encouragement. One older couple sent $50 with a letter explaining how they had once been forced to give up their farm animals and didn't want to see the same fate befall Emily. Others simply wrote to express admiration or offer moral support. While the sums weren't life-changing, they provided a much-needed morale boost, reminding Emily she wasn't as alone as she sometimes felt. Word of the article must have spread around Blackwood Farms as well. A few co-workers who had previously kept their distance now approached her with quiet words of solidarity. "Read about you and Midnight," one stable hand mumbled, awkwardly, leaving a small bag of better quality grain beside her workstation. Another simply patted her shoulder in passing, as if to say, "We're behind you, even if we can't say it outright." The subtle shift in attitude warmed Emily's heart more than she would have believed possible. But not everyone was pleased. Ronan Blackwood, upon hearing of the article, summoned Emily to his office one afternoon. The room was a stately space with dark wood paneling, heavy leather chairs, and a large window overlooking the training arena. As Emily stepped inside, her stomach churned. Ronan's face was impassive, and his eyes revealed nothing of his feelings. He gestured for her to sit, then leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "I'm aware of your little media stunt," he said in a clipped tone. "You're free to do what you want outside of work, but I don't want any misinformation reflecting poorly on Blackwood Farms. Understood?" Emily met his gaze, trying to steady her boredom. "There's nothing in the article that isn't true. I just told the story of what happened." She paused before adding more softly, "I never mentioned Blackwood Farms by name, just that I worked here." Ronan's jaw tightened a fraction. For a moment, the tension in the room felt almost suffocating. Then he exhaled and nodded curtly. "Fine. Keep your personal business separate from this farm. You have a job here as long as you do your work and don't interfere with mine. That's all." The meeting was over. Emily stood, gave a respectful nod, and exited, feeling like she had just tiptoed past a sleeping dragon without waking it. Summer came on slowly, bringing with it longer days that gave Emily a bit more flexibility in Midnight's rehab schedule. Dr. Caldwell still dropped by occasionally, his visits always heralded by the rumble of his old pickup. He'd watch Emily lead Midnight through carefully measured trot lines and stretches, all aimed at restoring muscle without straining the healing tendon. Each time, Caldwell seemed marginally more pleased than the last. "You've done well," he acknowledged one evening, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "If you keep this up, I see no reason he can't be sound enough for light riding, maybe even gentle trail rides someday." For Emily, the idea of riding Midnight, even at a casual pace, felt like a distant dream. She spent so much energy just trying to keep him healthy and feed him properly that she'd never paused to imagine a future where they could share the open fields together. The thought of it stirred something inside her, a mix of excitement and profound gratitude. If it ever happened, it would be a victory beyond measure, proof that neither of them had been broken beyond repair. Still, the practical concerns remained. While the modest donations from the newspaper article helped, the property tax clock was ticking ominously. She had put together half the amount needed by combining her diner wages, stable hand pay, and every spare dollar from those kind-hearted letters. But the bank's final deadline loomed ever closer, and she was nowhere near the full sum. Each day, a subtle dread gnawed at her, threatening to overshadow all the progress she and Midnight had made. That dread came to a head one scorching afternoon when Emily returned home to find another car in her driveway. This time, it wasn't a reporter but a man in a neat suit, one of the bank's officials. He introduced himself tersely and handed her an official notice. If the overdue amount wasn't paid in full by the end of the month, foreclosure proceedings would begin. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. She tried to explain her situation, but the man was sympathetic only to a point. "I'm sorry, Miss Hayes," he said not unkindly. "I'm just doing my job." After he left, Emily stood in the driveway, gripping the notice so tightly that her knuckles turned white. It was as if the universe had given her a prize, Midnight's recovering health, and then threatened to yank the ground out from beneath her feet. She fought the sting of tears as she looked toward the barn where Midnight was safely inside, away from the blistering sun. Losing the property meant losing the only safe haven he had ever known, aside from the plush stables of Blackwood Farms that no longer wanted him. But the idea of returning him to Ronan Blackwood or surrendering him to someone else was unthinkable. Steeling her resolve, Emily marched into the cabin and rummaged through her grandmother's old writing desk. She pulled out the antique jewelry box passed down through generations, opened it, and gazed upon its contents. A tarnished necklace, an old cameo brooch, and a ring with a small but genuine diamond. They were likely the most valuable items her grandmother had left behind. As she cradled the ring in her hand, Emily felt a pang of loss. This was an heirloom her grandmother had once worn with pride. But if selling it could buy her time, could keep Midnight's barn door from being padlocked, wasn't that worth it? The next morning, Emily took the ring to the only jeweler in town, a small shop wedged between a bakery and a pawn shop. The jeweler, a meticulous older man with half-moon spectacles, examined the ring under a bright lamp. He noted the diamond's modest size and the worn band, yet he offered Emily a price that was more generous than she dared hope for. Although it still wouldn't cover all her debts, it would bring her closer to the amount needed. With a trembling hand, Emily signed the paperwork, feeling as though she were signing away a piece of her family history. But she reminded herself that her grandmother would have wanted her to do what was necessary to secure a future for herself and for Midnight. Bolstered by the partial windfall, she made an immediate payment to the bank, buying herself a little extra time. It wasn't a complete fix, but the threat of immediate foreclosure receded slightly, giving her hope that she might somehow cobble together the remaining funds. Over the next week, she poured every free moment into side gigs, tutoring younger kids in basic math, walking dogs for her elderly neighbors, and even helping a local carpenter paint a small cottage. Every dollar earned felt like a small victory in a larger war, one she refused to lose. In the midst of this frantic scramble, Caldwell arrived unannounced one afternoon, a thoughtful look on his face. "I've been thinking," he said after he finished examining Midnight's leg, There's a small equine therapy center on the outskirts of the county. They specialize in helping children with developmental challenges and veterans dealing with PTSD. They're always looking for calm horses that can handle gentle riding and close human interaction. Midnight has that temperament. I've seen how he responds to kindness. Emily stared at him, torn. The idea of Midnight becoming a therapy horse was beautiful in theory, a testament to his gentle spirit, but it also implied that someone else might take him on, especially if the therapy center offered to pay or sponsor his upkeep. Dr. Caldwell must have read her apprehension because he quickly added, "They're not looking to buy him outright. They might be willing to partner with you. If his leg fully recovers for light riding, they could give him a role in their program. They might even help with some of the vet bills if he's used in sessions. Think about it. It could be a way to ensure he's never cast aside again." Emily felt a rush of conflicting emotions. Could she really entrust Midnight to an organization she knew little about, even if it meant easing her financial burden? She asked Dr. Caldwell for more information, and he promised to set up a meeting with the therapy center's director. After he left, Emily led Midnight into the paddock for his afternoon exercises, her mind spinning with possibilities. She watched him walk through the tall grass, noticing how far he'd come from the limping, frightened horse who first arrived. The idea that he could help others heal, just as he was healing, filled her with a profound sense of awe. Perhaps this was the future she'd never dared imagine, a chance for both of them to move beyond survival into something meaningful. Even as uncertainty loomed over her finances, Emily found renewed determination. Life had been relentless in testing her resolve, but each new challenge had also revealed new avenues for hope. If selling a treasured heirloom, telling her story to a reporter, or partnering with a therapy center meant securing a better life for Midnight, then she would do it. After all, she had promised him more than just survival. She'd promised him a second chance at the dignity and love he deserved. Looking back, it's astounding to see how each small step, each act of kindness, and each spark of faith converged to heal both Midnight's wounded body and Emily's weary heart. The bank never did repossess her grandmother's land. Last-minute donations, part-time work, and a leap of faith carried Emily through the financial storm. Midnight, though never quite the fierce competitor he once was, found a deeper purpose in therapy and gentle lessons, showing every skeptic that a discarded champion still holds boundless worth. In the end, their story is a testament to the power of second chances, human compassion, and relentless determination. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment sharing what moved you most or any lessons you took away. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and never forget to subscribe for more uplifting stories that celebrate hope against all odds.